The way value is derived has definitely evolved. Are regulators redefining what counts as a thing of value? Where are the gray areas right now?
It's one of those things about RESPA that's either great or not great, depending on what side of the coin you're on, because there's no guidance, there's no definition or formula that's promulgated that tells you how to arrive at a thing of value. I do think there's some tried and true formulas that folks have developed, but technology has definitely changed it. Right? And so it does feel like we're sometimes in a position of trying to jam ourselves into old guidance to give us that compliant argument when in reality it doesn't make sense.
Welcome back to Keys to Real Estate. If you've been watching the regulatory landscape lately, you may have noticed something that feels a little unusual. On the federal side, things have been quieter, especially around RESPA Section 8 enforcement. But quieter doesn't necessarily mean simpler. So today, we're stepping back to take a closer look at what's really happening at the federal level, what's changed, what hasn't, and what might be coming next. And to help us unpack all that, I'm joined by Holly Bunting, partner at Mayer Brown and one of the industry's leading voices on RESPA. Holly spends her time advising companies right in the middle of these questions, so she brings both perspective and practicality to this conversation. Now, in this first part, we'll focus on the federal landscape, how enforcement priorities are shifting, what risks still exist, and why quiet doesn't necessarily mean safe. The presenting sponsor for this season of Keys to Real Estate is First American Trust. First American Trust redefines banking for title and escrow companies. They offer innovative solutions that integrate banking functions directly into title and escrow software systems, enhancing operational efficiency and safeguarding financial transactions. At First American Trust, you have direct access to a personal relationship manager who delivers answers in real time. First American Trust is also recognized as an elite provider for the American Land Title Association. As a wholly owned subsidiary of First American Financial Corporation, they have roots in real estate tracing back over 135 years and is the only bank owned by a title company. With deep roots, advanced solutions, and a commitment to real relationships, they are setting a new standard for the industry. The future of banking for title and escrow starts with First American Trust. Visit firstamtrust.com to learn more. Well, Holly Bunting, RESPA expert extraordinaire, welcome to Keys to Real Estate. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we have to talk RESPA, and I'd like to start today, if we could, about the national stage, because it seems like there's a noticeable shift in RESPA enforcement. Again, at least at the federal level, things feel a little quieter, at least with Section 8. At the state level, that's where activity seems to be picking up, especially around joint ventures and referral relationships. So we wanted to get you in today to really talk about that. And I'd like to do it in two parts, if that's okay. For today, I'd love to talk about the federal landscape. And then in our next episode next week, I'd like to really drill down on what the states are up to. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right. So federally, as I mentioned, we've been seeing fewer new CFPB Section 8 cases recently, and even some are getting dismissed or closed out. So I'm wondering, do you feel like it's a true pullback or a shift in priorities, or what's your sense of what's going on?
So I do think it's a shift in priorities. The past year with the CFPB has been sort of a back and forth between efforts to shut it down completely and then litigation that requires them to request funding, efforts to terminate employees and so forth. And so I do think there's a shift in priorities, and even sort of in the midst of all of that was happening, they did issue a priorities memo in April of 2025. While mortgage was one of their priorities, they also noted that they're really focused on military families and veterans, fair credit reporting, fair debt collection issues. And so RESPA was not on that list. And so that's not to say that if some golden facts landed in their lap that just made their mouth water, wouldn't cause them to pursue that from an enforcement perspective. I just don't think it's part of their priorities.
Yeah, so maybe more of a temporary lull, or do you think the Bureau is fundamentally changed for a long time to come?
So I think it's reflective of the current administration. Russell Vogt, who's the director of the OMB, he's the acting director of the CFPB. There was attempts to nominate Jonathan McKernan way back in the spring, and that didn't go anywhere because he took another position at Treasury. And so that put Vogt back in the acting directorship. And there's no secret that prior to the the election that dismantling the CFPB was one of his priorities. And so I think he has operated the agency with that sort of underlying desire as it relates to the Bureau. But at the same time, recognizing that there's statutory legal requirements that they have to carry out. If the administration changes to a Democratic president to the next election, I would not expect the CFPB to continue looking like this. I think we'll see lots of hiring. I think we'll see the enforcement branch being beefed back up. We'll see more focus on enforcement, which could include RESPA. So I do think it's temporary. And like with most changes in presidential administrations, the regulatory agencies are impacted based on their priorities. And so I think that's what we're in the middle of now.
Yeah, it sure feels like that. And obviously you advise companies and for your clients today, the enforcement risk might be lower right now, but don't expect that to hold. And do we need to talk about statutes of limitations? If it's a new Democratic administration, how far back could they reach about activities that are maybe going on in business right now that aren't being as scrutinized today?
Yeah, it's a good point. And that's exactly what we tell clients. Is while there may be low risk right now, that could change. And there is a 3-year statute of limitations under the RESPA statute. So the federal government can look back 3 years. The CFPB under the Biden administration would often tack on an unfair and deceptive act and practice claim to a RESPA violation. And they would do that and make the argument that there was really no statute of limitations that applied to them in their own enforcement actions. And so they would really try to broaden the look back period as part of that enforcement. So 3 years is what the statute says, but the CFPB has certainly used other tools in the past to try to stretch that and look back even longer.
Having put that proviso now that you are advising clients, stay on the straight and narrow because this isn't probably forever. I'm wondering if you have some examples of the types of things that might have for sure triggered an investigation 2 years ago that might not right now, or just wholesale closed down areas that aren't really being enforced that definitely would have been in the prior administration?
I think a good example, right before the change in administration, the CFPB had filed suit against Rocket and another real estate brokerage entity making RESPA claims. And then this administration dismissed that complaint, withdrew that complaint. And we've seen private plaintiffs now sort of pick up some of those allegations and move with it. So I do think strategic arrangements of all forms were on the prior CFPB's radar. They certainly have enforcement history with joint ventures, with marketing arrangements, even promotional type arrangements. We saw that in some of their consent orders from the Biden CFPB. So I don't think anything was really off limits at that point. Now I just think it's a wholesale shift in priority. And I mean, I would expect that the same types of arrangements we've seen be subject to enforcement in the past will be the same kinds of arrangements we'll see in the future that catch a regulator's attention.
Do we need to double click on those private rights of action? Because I think that's part of some folks' rear flank that they might not be as in tune to as they might need to be.
Yeah, no, that's a great point as well. And with the pause in enforcement at the federal level, we've definitely seen an increase in private consumer litigation that's been filed. And so under RESPA, consumers do have a private right of action. There's a 1-year statute of limitations. And based on the statute, they can recover up to 3 times the cost of the settlement service that they paid. So that's significant. And when you think about it on a class basis, which is often how these are filed, the potential damages could be significant. So, and we've seen that. We've seen RESPA class actions filed over the past several months. I noted that the Rocket has been hit with one. Zillow, others are seeing these class actions as well. And a lot of them are focused on relationships with real estate agents and how those consumers pass back and forth between real estate and mortgage. But nonetheless, I think it does highlight a trend, which is when the federal government slows enforcement, then I think plaintiffs' attorneys certainly see an opportunity to pursue RESPA class actions.
I definitely want to underline that part of the conversation if we can a little bit. We just closed our annual Voice of the Title Agent survey and are going through the results, and we're going to be reporting on those. But those ABAs with real estate brokers and individual real estate agents, there was quite a bit of fussing about those in that survey. So could you expand on that a little bit more about what we're seeing, what the rights of action are? Are these things generally constructed well? They're just new, and so people are not knowing how to address them, or are there some real issues there? What are you seeing?
I think those really have become issues at the state level.
Great. We'll talk more about that next week. While Section 8 cases have generally been a little quieter, we're still seeing active enforcement around Reg X stuff with loss mitigation, borrower communications, process failures. So I'm wondering, is that where more enforcement is remaining consistent, and what are we seeing there?
That was one of the priorities on that memo from the CFPB back in April. And when they filed a notice with the OMB for rulemaking, pre-proposal and proposed rulemaking, Reg X and Reg Z servicing regulations were on that list. So no question that is something that the current CFPB is looking at. We just don't know what that's going to be. We haven't seen anything come out from them, even after having submitted the OMB back in June. So it's been quite a while. I don't know that enforcement will necessarily come out of the CFPB as it relates to those particular issues. I mean, they are focused on their complaints process. They just requested a series of comments from folks on their intake form and what that looks like when consumers are submitting a complaint to the CFPB. I do think those changes are designed to maybe reduce some of those complaints rather than increase them. But at the same time, I would expect that the complaints would be more specific and more perhaps helpful in terms of identifying those that might be legitimate. And we've seen that servicing loss mitigation has been an area where consumers have complained to the CFPB a lot in the past. So all in all, I do think it's a priority. We just haven't seen anything come to fruition yet based on that priority.
Okay. From some of those consumer complaints that we've seen for servicers especially, what's the nature of some of the most common complaint? Like, where are those perceived breakdowns coming from lenders and servicers?
So, I mean, I think a lot of it is just often sort of a breakdown in communication, right? Okay. Consumers may not understand or may not feel like that their needs are being met. Credit reporting is often a huge complaint as it relates to servicing, and credit reporting, again, was one of those things that made the priority list for the CFPB. And then similarly with, fair debt collection was another one of their priorities I mentioned, and just the way that folks communicate with consumers in an attempt to, whether it's restart mortgage payments or follow through on loss mitigation. I think those are complaints as well. I mean, often complaints they don't hold water, right? I mean, often folks are expecting things that legally they're not entitled to, and, sort of setting those aside. I do think it's that interaction with the consumer and making sure they understand what's going on that really is a priority.
Someone told me yesterday, and I had not seen this survey, that 50% of buyers admit to having tears at some point through the process. And so I think those two things kind of feed on each other, right? Of when you're having the anxiety and your frustration and those communication steps don't always go perfectly, it really kind of can blow up into something pretty awful.
Absolutely. It's the largest purchase, right, a consumer makes, and they may not make that many of them over the course of their adult life. And so, yes, it's stressful. And, we hear stories all the time, right, of folks who have got the moving van packed and it's in the parking lot of the settlement agent's office, and something happens last minute and, oh my God, what are they going to do? Right. There's enough stories like that, yes, it's high stakes. And I definitely think regulators recognize that.
Yeah, for sure. We had a couple of executive orders come out of the White House about some housing policy issues. Was there anything noteworthy in there with regard to RESPA matters or focuses for the federal government?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to mention that as well. Also, as it relates to the CFPB, right? Because one of those executive orders was focused on mortgage. And while it's kind of phrased to suggest the intent is to really help small banks and community banks get back into the mortgage business, the directives, there are a lot of directives in there for the CFPB, and that apply more broadly than to small and community banks. So for instance, as it relates to RESPA, more on the TRID side. So I think there's a directive for the CFPB to consider whether or not there is some way to change the timing requirements as it relates to TRID to let consumers get to the closing table a little bit quicker, or to address some of the issues that aren't clear as it relates to the TRID disclosures. But then outside of origination, same thing with servicing. Are there some ways to consider streamlining and reducing burdens as it relates to the servicing requirements as well? And then they talk about ATR, ability to repay, and qualified mortgage. The idea, of course, based on the executive order, is that mortgage lending has become so expensive because of the range of regulations that came into play after Dodd-Frank Act was passed. And so this is intended to try to have those agencies look at them and scale them back in a way that doesn't create a necessary risk, but does reduce burdens. So the EO is phrased as directing these agencies to consider these things. It's not a directive to do these things. So it'll be interesting what comes out of that. The other executive order was related more to construction, and that one did have more directives of items that agencies are supposed to actually do in the coming months. But that one, I think, also recognizes that construction is largely state and local in terms of restrictions. But one of the things it does is direct federal agencies to create a list of best practices that states and local governments could implement to try to reduce burdens and increase construction. So we'll see, but I thought it interesting that with all of the back and forth and drama with the CFPB, here's this executive order that gives them a whole list of things to do. We'll see what actually comes out of it.
Yeah, and we'll see how it all harmonizes with anything that comes out in its final form from Congress too, because there are many things in there that work seemingly in tandem, and there are a few that seem to be a little bit independent. So it'll be interesting to see how all that merges together. Okay, well, back to our old friend RESPA directly. Our favorite part is always hinged on a thing of value, but the way value is derived has definitely evolved. Marketing practices, data, platform access, and leads. Are regulators redefining sort of what counts as a thing of value? And also with that, I'd like to know, where are the gray areas right now that haven't really been clearly tested, or we haven't found exactly the boundary lines of those yet?
It's a great question. And it's one of those things about RESPA that's either great or not great, depending on what side of the coin you're on, because there's no guidance, right? There's no definition or formula that's promulgated that tells you how to arrive at thing of value or to create a fair market value when you're performing services. It really is up to interpretation. I mean, I think over time, at least as it relates to fair market value, the industry has created best practices, right? You look at cost of provision of services. You look to see if there's a similar service on the out in the general market that you can compare price to. So I do think there's some tried and true formulas that folks have developed, but technology has definitely changed it, right? So I mean, you look at a co-advertisement 20 years ago was probably in print in a magazine, which has a fixed cost from the publisher, right? You can measure on the page, how much you have of that particular advertisement and then share the cost accordingly. Everything is digital now, and that is really difficult to do. Even at some point we talked about, does it make sense to measure pixels? I mean, I'll be honest, I don't even know what that means.
I don't know how to measure a pixel.
Right. I am not a tech person. I cannot help you measure pixels. But I think it's a constant conversation, right? Like, what makes sense here? And also with technology, we've had folks say it costs us nothing to produce these. We've got, again, using co-marketing as an example, it costs nothing to produce these flyers. We post them on the web. We don't have to print them anymore. So how do you share the cost? And so it does sort of feel like we're sometimes in a position of trying to jam ourselves into old guidance to give us that compliant argument when in reality it doesn't make sense. But I mean, just as an example with that, it costs us nothing to produce. I mean, my response to folks is, well, you do employ someone who does the graphic design. You've got technology that you pay for that allows you to create those. So when you dig into it, I think you can come up with a cost and then figure out how to share it. But no question that there's no guidance from the regulators or in the law. And you're really just trying to put yourself in a best place to defend what you're doing.
And at one point, the Bureau had flagged some concerns about digital comparison platforms, compared them to pay-to-play models. And how serious is that risk, do you think, today? And again, if you're somebody that's participating in these platforms, what should you be thinking about when if God forbid you do have to defend yourself?
Right. Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that one in particular, because one of the things the CFPB did is withdrew like over 60 guidance documents and policy statements, but they did not withdraw that one. So they left that RESPA policy statement in place. And who knows what kind of conclusion to draw for that? Is that because they just missed it? Or is it because they believe in the guidance behind it? Who knows?
I don't know.
But
and how reliable those are anyway.
Exactly. That's exactly right. But at the end of the day, it still exists. It's still a policy statement that has not been withdrawn. And so I think folks should continue to give it the same deference that they would have under a prior administration. And at the end of the day, I think that, when you're participating in these online platforms where consumers do have a opportunity to shop. I think in a lot of cases, it's pretty evident when there are actions being taken to emphasize or push one provider to the top. So that if you're a consumer looking at that page and ABC Mortgage, you're getting hit over the head with ABC Mortgage because they're highlighted in bold and they've got 3 stars and they're outlined in yellow and everybody else is just in a blacklist. ABC Mortgage is paying extra for that emphasis. I think that's no question, even before the digital comparison shopping platform, that kind of activity would have been risky from a RESPA perspective. While I think that bulletin or that policy statement goes a bit too far on how it sort of interprets and views what they almost sort of call steering in a way. Right. At the end of the day, it's, are you infirmly influencing a consumer selection of a particular provider? And has someone paid for that referral? And those are still the rules. That's ultimately what folks should be thinking about when they're evaluating how they pay for appearance on these types of platforms. I've heard folks say, these folks are just not willing to work with us. We think there's a problem with how they display us on the platform and they're not really willing to work with us. And at the end of the day, it's risk for both sides. And that's something I like to remind folks as well. Like, the platform would be the one deemed to have made the referral if that's in fact what they're doing. And so they have risk as much as you do. And I find that folks don't necessarily always appreciate that, hey, I'm just a tech company that creates a website. RESPA, I'm not subject to RESPA. You're a person, right? RESPA prohibits a person. And so that equal liability often can get folks to sort of take a step back and consider that, maybe we should be a bit more flexible with these platforms.
I agree with you. I've heard that argument that from tech companies, we're not a service provider as defined under RESPA of settlement services. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's there, but also a person is it right. May not, shall not, something. And so that's a kind of a rosier outlook than I think. It's more risk than I would feel comfortable carrying. I'll say it like that. Do you think some of these things that we've talked about, our old gal RESPA is
1974.
Do you feel like we have any chance in the next handful of years, single digit number of years of getting her in for like a facelift and a redo? Or do you think we're just kind of stuck with what she was from 1974?
Well, I mean, there are definitely efforts among the trade associations to do that. And I would think now would probably be the time to get CFPB on board to try to address regulatory changes that could really help ease the burden. Some things ultimately would require statutory change. And I don't know, who knows, right, with Congress these days, if that would ever become a priority. But I do think there is a potential for regulatory change. And I know various trade associations are having those conversations with folks at the CFPB. I think now that we seem to have sort of settled that the CFPB is not going to go away. I mean, Vote requested funds from the Federal Reserve in January to fund the agency. There was a court decision last week that basically said you can't not request funds based on the theories you set forth. So I do think we're going to see consistent funding at this point and more resources to potentially tackle requests for regulatory changes.
Yeah. Well, if you go back and watch a movie from 1974 today, some things are going to remain the same, like crime's still crime, blah, blah, blah. But there are also, I mean, it's such a different world that I would love to see an update, modernization to just give both consumers and industry some new lines of the road. And so we don't have to sort of stumble it around, use our best. Well, the weather vane was this on this topic. So we're going to extrapolate that over into this new situation that isn't addressed. I, am a big proponent of getting a little tune-up there to the RESPA.
Absolutely. In 1974, the stated purpose from Congress was consumers are paying more because of these referral payments in the market. I mean, that premise on its own, right, needs to be reassessed. Title is a perfect example, right? When you've got title insurance policies that are filed rates or otherwise consistent in a particular state, consumers aren't paying more for title insurance. And so, yeah, the premise definitely needs to be revisited, but that would require Congress to buy in.
Yeah. And to the point of tech and the business, we have the data now. We don't have to guess anymore. To get to the data, you don't have to go into all the attorneys' offices and open up their physical files. The data is available. So that's great. Well, it sounds like at the federal level, definitely not gone, a little quieter for now, hopefully evolving, but also keep in mind statutes of limitations. And sounds like don't get too crazy. When we come back next week, we'll dive down into some of these states that have picked up where maybe the CFPB has left off a little bit recently. So we'll see you all back next time. Thanks so much, Holly. And audience, if you're taking a look at the federal picture right now, it may feel like enforcement has eased, but as Holly pointed out, that's likely more of a pause than it is a permanent change. So between shifting priorities, evolving interpretations, and the reality of look-back periods, this is not a moment to get complacent. It's a moment to stay thoughtful about how your business practices would hold up under a different lens, because that lens can change quickly. Now, as we hinted throughout this conversation, the story does not stop at the federal level. In our next episode, we're going to shift gears and head into the states, where activity is picking up and in a meaningful way, especially around joint ventures and referral relationships. So join us next time as we continue this conversation with Holly Bunting and take a closer look at where state regulators are stepping in and what that means for your business.